Vincent van Gogh was a Dutch post-impressionist painter who is among the most famous and influential figures in the history of Western art. During his working life he created approximately 2,100 artworks, including around 860 oil paintings, most of them in the last 3 years of his life. During his lifetime, only one of his paintings was ever sold. Van Gogh has been mythologized in the popular imagination as the quintessential tortured artist, in part due to the sometimes harrowing details of his life revealed in an extensive collection of the letters he wrote to his brother over many years. Van Gogh's art became astoundingly popular after his death, especially in the late 20th century, when his works sold for record-breaking sums at auctions around the world, and were featured in blockbuster touring exhibitions. Vincent Willem van Gogh was born on March 30, 1853 in Groot-Zundert, in the predominantly Catholic province of North Brabant in the Netherlands. He was the oldest surviving child of Theodorus van Gogh, a Protestant minister of the Dutch Reformed Church, and his wife, Anna Cornelia Carbentus. Vincent's birth was followed by that of 5 siblings, Anna, Theo, Elizabeth, Wilhelmina and Cornelis. Vincent was a serious and thoughtful child who was taught at home by his mother and a governess until he was 7, when he was sent to a local school. He was placed in a boarding school at age 11, and then at 13 his parents sent him to a middle school in Tilburg. He was deeply unhappy there, feeling abandoned. In 1868, he abruptly returned home, having quit the school halfway through his second academic year. He never went back to school. He later wrote that his youth was austere, cold and sterile. In July 1869, Vincent's uncle, who was a partner in the art dealer Goupil and Company, found the 16-year-old Van Gogh a job as a trainee at the Hague branch of his company. Van Gogh earned a steady income by packing art in the company's warehouse, which he thoroughly enjoyed. After completing his training in 1873, he was transferred to Goupil's London branch and took lodgings in Stockwell. This was a happy time for Van Gogh. He was successful at work and at 20, was earning more than his father. Daily contact with works of art aroused his artistic sensibility. He soon began to appreciate Rembrandt, Frans Hals, and other Dutch masters, although his preference was for 2 contemporary French painters, Jean-François Millet and Camille Corot, whose influence was to last throughout his life. While in Stockwell, he became infatuated with his landlady's daughter, but she rejected him after he confessed his feelings, telling him she was secretly engaged to a former lodger. This unrequited love was a huge setback for Van Gogh, sending the once optimistic young man into a spiral of depression. His burning desire for human affection thwarted, he became increasingly solitary. Shortly afterwards, his employer transferred him to Paris where his sadness and isolation increased. He turned to religion, writing letters to Theo full of quotes from the Bible, and accounts of church services and sermons. Despite his fascination with art, Van Gogh became less and less interested in his job, feeling that the dealers commodified art, which he believed should be available to all. Sensing his lack of interest, Goupil dismissed him in April 1876. Looking for a change of direction, Van Gogh decided to leave the art trade and become an educator. He applied for teaching jobs in England, and was offered a position at a boys' boarding school in Ramsgate where he worked as an assistant teacher in exchange for room and board, but without pay. The school relocated to Isleworth and Van Gogh transferred with them, but the arrangement was not successful, and he immediately took another job in Isleworth at the Thomas Slade Jones boarding school, as an assistant teacher. In December 1876, Van Gogh left Isleworth to spend the holidays with his parents in Holland, where his father advised him not to return to England. Van Gogh followed his advice, and stayed in Etten for the next 6 months, walking and sketching the landscape. He worked for a short time as a shop assistant in a bookshop near Rotterdam, but felt unhappy in the position. Rather than work, he spent his time doodling, or translating passages from the Bible into English, French, and German. He immersed himself in Christianity and became increasingly pious and monastic. After a few months, still searching for a direction in life, Van Gogh asked his parents if he could study theology, and they agreed. He left for Amsterdam in mid-May to prepare for his theology studies. In Amsterdam he lived with his uncle, Johannes Stricker, a respected theologian. Vincent spent a year there, while Stricker helped him prepare for his theology entrance exam. Unfortunately, he failed. All his family's support had come to nothing. Vincent appeared to lack the discipline to study. He preferred to wander around the city and sketch his surroundings, and to take long walks in the countryside. His uncle advised him to forget studying. Determined to make a difference in the world, he left Amsterdam in July 1878 to take up student lodgings near Brussels, where he started a 3-month Protestant missionary school training course. In January 1879, he was appointed by the Belgian Evangelization Committee to work for a 6-month trial period as a preacher in a village in the coal mining region of the Borinage. In a letter to Theo in April 1879, he described where he was living. "It's a somber place, and at first sight everything around it has something dismal and deathly about it. The workers here are usually emaciated and pale owing to fever. They look exhausted and haggard, weather-beaten and prematurely old. The women are generally sallow and withered." Unfortunately, Van Gogh's trial period was not successful. According to the committee, he failed to establish a close-knit community of worshippers. His contract was not renewed after the initial 6 months. This rejection led Van Gogh to volunteer as a preacher in another village in the Borinage, where he continued his evangelical work without official employment. He lived among the miners and their families, sharing their poverty, and recording their daily lives in his sketchbooks. He slept on the floor of his shack and gave away his possessions. His dedication was such that he was nicknamed the Christ of the coal mine. His efforts were heartfelt, but the locals viewed him as mentally ill. His humble living conditions did not endear him to church authorities, and he was removed by his church. Penniless and feeling that his faith was destroyed, he sank into despair and withdrew from everyone. "They think I'm a madman, because I wanted to be a true Christian," he told an acquaintance. "They turned me out like a dog, saying that I was causing a scandal." Having no job and little money, Van Gogh walked the 75 kilometers to Brussels, and finally gave in to pressure from his parents to return home to Etten. He stayed there until around March 1880, which caused concern and frustration for his parents. His father was especially frustrated, and advised that his son be committed to the lunatic asylum in a nearby town. Vincent van Gogh often included little sketches in the letters he sent his brother Theo, and sometimes enclosed a drawing of what he had seen. This eventually led to a turning point in his life, when Theo advised him to concentrate more on his drawing. Van Gogh now became convinced that he could also serve God as an artist. He decided that his mission from then on would be to bring consolation to humanity through art. He explained to his brother Theo, "I want to give the wretched a brotherly message. When I sign my paintings, Vincent, it is as one of them." This realization of his creative powers restored his self-confidence. At Theo's suggestion, Van Gogh moved to Brussels in October 1880, to study with the Dutch artist Willem Roelofs, who persuaded him to attend the Royal Academy of Fine Arts. He registered in November 1880, and studied anatomy and the standard rules of modeling and perspective. Van Gogh's artistic career was extremely short, lasting only the 10 years from 1880 to 1890. During the first 4 years of this period, while acquiring technical proficiency, he confined himself almost entirely to drawings and watercolors. He began to work on his drawing technique, and came into contact with other artists. He no longer had a paid job, and lived on the money Theo sent him from time to time. In the spring of 1881, Van Gogh moved back in with his parents, who were now living in Etten. He practiced drawing and frequently worked out of doors. In the meantime, his brother Theo had been appointed manager of Goupil and Company in Paris. He continued to support Vincent financially, so that he could focus entirely on his art. Van Gogh's parents, by contrast, were extremely disappointed that their eldest son had chosen the life of an artist, which in their eyes was synonymous with social failure. He continued to draw, often using his neighbors as subjects. In August 1881, his recently widowed cousin, Cornelia Key Vos Stricker, daughter of his mother's older sister Wilhelmina, arrived for a visit. Van Gogh was thrilled, and took long walks with her. Key was 7 years older than he was, and had an 8-year-old son. Van Gogh surprised everyone by declaring his love for her, and proposing marriage. She refused him, and would not meet him. Her parents wrote that Van Gogh's persistence is disgusting. Key's father made it clear that her refusal should be heeded, and that the two would not marry, largely because of Van Gogh's inability to support himself. In despair, Van Gogh threatened to hold his hand in the flame of a candle, saying, "Let me see her for as long as I can keep my hand in the flame." Van Gogh's persistence did not go down well with his family, and following an argument with his father, Van Gogh walked out of his parents' house on Christmas Day 1881, and moved to The Hague. In The Hague, Van Gogh tried to sell his paintings. Feeling his drawing technique was not yet good enough, he also continued to practice obsessively. He also made contact with a cousin by marriage, Anton Mauve, who was the successful artist Van Gogh longed to be. Late in 1881, Mauve took Van Gogh on as a student, and taught him the basics of painting in watercolor and oils. Van Gogh visited his studio almost every day. He liked the medium, and he spread the paint liberally, scraping from the canvas and working back with the brush. He wrote that he was surprised at how good the results were. In early 1882, Vincent van Gogh met Sien Hornick. She became both his model and his lover. Van Gogh's friends and family, including Mauve, were shocked, as Sien was a former prostitute. Also, she was pregnant, and already had a 5-year-old daughter. Van Gogh felt sorry for Sien, and was determined to take care of her. They rented a studio in which she, the little girl and the new baby, who was born in July, could all live together. Theo did not approve of his brother's choice, but continued to support him financially. During this period, Van Gogh produced over 50 drawings of Sien and her family, depicting her in various domestic scenes and roles. These artworks provide the primary visual record of Sien's appearance and life with Van Gogh. When Van Gogh met Sien, she was sick, weak from postoperative complications and venereal disease. Van Gogh attempted to nurse her back to health, and she became a tragic muse for him. Both suffered from depression and alcoholism, and their relationship created a permanent rift between Van Gogh and his family and friends. Mauve abruptly ceased his support and tutelage within a few weeks of Van Gogh meeting Sien. This sudden change suggests that the discovery of Van Gogh's relationship with Sien may have been the final straw for Mauve. In his painting, Sorrow, a portrait of Van Gogh's mistress, we see the progress that the artist had made after 2 years of serious study. Sorrow is a poignant work, simple in execution, but representative of the exhaustion of the working poor. The quote across the bottom of the drawing translates to, "How can there be on earth a woman alone and abandoned?" Van Gogh considered Sorrow to be one of his most effective portraits. "I want to make drawings that touch people," he said. "Sorrow is a small beginning. It is at least something directly from my own heart." When Van Gogh's father discovered the details of the couple's relationship, he put pressure on his son to abandon Sien and her 2 children. Van Gogh at first defied him, and considered moving the family out of the city, but in late 1883 he left, leaving Sean and the children behind. Poverty may have pushed Sean back into prostitution as the home became less happy, or Van Gogh may have felt family life was irreconcilable with his artistic development. Whatever the reason, he was gone. Sean gave her daughter to her mother, and baby Willem to her brother. Later, in 1904, Sean drowned herself in the river Scheldt. Later, in a letter to Theo, Van Gogh commented on the relationship. "I knew from the outset that her character was ruined, but I had hopes of her finding her feet. Now, when I think about the things I saw in her, I realize that she was already too far gone to recover." In September 1883, following his split with Sean, the urge to be alone with nature took Van Gogh to Drenthe, an isolated part of the northern Netherlands frequented by Mauve and other Dutch artists, where he spent 3 months. He thought the landscape beautiful, and set to work in good spirits. Nevertheless, the province did not only bring him peace and inspiration. "Drenthe is superb," he said. "But staying there depends on many things. You need the money for it, and you need to be able to endure the loneliness." After less than 3 months, the rain, cold and isolation drove him away from Drenthe to his parents' new home in the village of Nuenen. He initially worked in a small studio at the back of the house, but after a few months, he rented a larger space elsewhere in the village. From August 1884, a neighbor's daughter who was 10 years older than Van Gogh, joined him on his trips to the country. They fell in love and wanted to marry, but neither side of their families approved. The girl was distraught, and tried to poison herself, but survived after Van Gogh rushed her to a nearby hospital, but the relationship was over. He remained at Nuenen during most of 1884 and 1885, and during these years his art grew bolder and more assured. He focused on painting and drawing. Working outside and very quickly, he completed sketches and paintings of weavers and their cottages, as well as the vicarage at Nuenen. He painted 3 types of subjects: still life, landscape, and figures. These subjects were all interrelated, referring to the daily life of peasants, to the hardships they endured, and to the countryside they cultivated. During his 2-year stay in Nuenen, he completed numerous drawings and watercolors, and nearly 200 oil paintings. His palette consisted mainly of somber earth tones, particularly dark brown, and showed no sign of the vivid colors that would distinguish his later work. After some interest from a dealer in Paris, Theo asked Vincent if he had paintings ready to exhibit. Van Gogh responded with his first major work, The Potato Eaters, and a series of peasant character studies, which were the culmination of several years of work. In August, his work was publicly exhibited for the first time, in the shop windows of an art dealer in The Hague. Van Gogh's understanding of the possibilities of painting was evolving rapidly. From studying artist Frans Hals, he learned to portray the freshness of a visual impression, while the works of Eugene Delacroix taught him that color can express something by itself. This led to his enthusiasm for Peter Paul Rubens' method of direct notation, and his ability to express a mood by a combination of colors, which proved decisive in the development of Van Gogh's style. Van Gogh was aware that many of the faults in his paintings were due to lack of experience and technical expertise, so in November 1885 he moved to Antwerp and enrolled at the Academy of Art in the city. He rented a room above a paint dealer's shop, and also a small space adjacent to his room, which he used as a studio. It was quite small, but it allowed him to work at home in bad weather. He lived there in poverty. He ate poorly, preferring to spend the money Theo sent on painting materials and models. Bread, coffee, and tobacco became his staple diet. In February 1886, he wrote to Theo that he could only remember eating 6 hot meals since the previous May. His teeth became loose and painful. He was drinking heavily again, and was hospitalized between February and March 1886, when he was possibly also treated for syphilis. Antwerp had plenty to offer Van Gogh: good materials, drawing clubs with models, as well as grand architecture, and churches, museums and galleries stuffed with art. The drawing classes he took at the academy were, however, far too traditional for him. He found the teaching methods and the academic approach to art frustrating. In a letter to Theo in January 1886, he wrote, "I find all the drawings I see here hopelessly bad and fundamentally wrong. I know mine are totally different, so time will tell who's right. Damn it, not one of them has any feeling for what a classical statue is." Rather than completing his studies, or sitting for a final exam, Van Gogh left the academy after 3 months to join Theo in Paris. He shared Theo's apartment in Montmartre, and studied at Fernand Cormon's studio. Cormon was an artist who was very popular with foreign students. In June, the brothers took a larger flat in Montmartre. By the end of 1886, Theo found living with his brother to be almost unbearable, but by early 1887, Van Gogh had moved to a northwestern suburb of Paris, and peace reigned between them once again. In Paris, Van Gogh painted portraits of friends and acquaintances, still life paintings, views of Le Moulin de la Galette, scenes in Montmartre, Asnières and along the Seine. Still concerned with improving his drawing, Van Gogh mixed with other artists, some of whom were to play historic roles in modern art. They opened his eyes to the latest developments in French painting. All those new impressions and new people had an influence on his work and inspired him to experiment freely. The dark tones of the Potato Eaters quickly gave way to brighter colors, as in The Hill of Montmartre with Stone Quarry. The changes that his painting underwent in Paris between the spring of 1886 and February 1888 led to the creation of his personal idiom and style of brushwork. His palette at last became colorful, his vision less traditional, and his tonalities lighter. By the summer of 1887, he was painting in pure colors, and using broken brushwork that is at times pointillistic. The themes he painted likewise changed, with rural laborers giving way to cafés and boulevards, and the countryside along the Seine. He also tried out more commercial subjects, such as portraits. Van Gogh mostly acted as his own sitter, however, as models were relatively expensive. Finally, by the beginning of 1888, Van Gogh's post-impressionist style had crystallized, resulting in such masterpieces as Portrait of Père Tanguy and Self-Portrait in Straw Hat, as well as in some landscapes of the Parisian suburbs. Van Gogh came to believe that the effect of color went beyond the descriptive. He believed it had psychological and moral weight. Yellow meant the most to him, because it symbolized emotional truth. He used yellow as a symbol for sunlight, life, and God. In 1887, a theater manager hung Van Gogh's painting Garden with Courting Couples in the rehearsal room of his Théâtre Libre in Paris, alongside works by Georges Seurat and Paul Signac. In this work, one of the largest Van Gogh produced, he had begun to paint with small strokes of paint to provide texture. Seen from a distance, they create an optical blend of hues. The style stresses the ability of complementary colors, including blue and orange, to form vibrant contrast. In November 1887, Theo and Vincent befriended Paul Gauguin, who had just arrived in Paris. Gauguin's Martinique paintings were exhibited at his Color Merchants Gallery. There, they were seen and admired by Vincent and Theo. Theo purchased 3 of Gauguin's paintings for 900 francs, including The Mango Trees, and arranged to have them hung at his gallery, where wealthy clients might see them. At the same time, Van Gogh and Gauguin became friends and they corresponded together on art. While in Paris, Van Gogh organized an exhibition of art by some of his artist friends at the Grand Bien Restaurant du Chalet. All the participating artists worked in the area of Montmartre and usually showed their pieces in small venues such as cafes and restaurants. Van Gogh's contributions to the exhibition were particularly notable. Among his displayed works were several self-portraits, which his friend Émile Bernard described as fiery faces. These self-portraits showcased Van Gogh's experimental use of color, featuring flecks of paint that acted more like a mask covering the face than a means of representation. The exhibition was a brief one, as Van Gogh soon fell out with the restaurant's owner, who claimed that the paintings were distracting diners from ordering their food. Vincent responded by packing up all the art and taking it back to his flat. In some ways the show was successful. Vincent wrote afterward that he did not regret his efforts. Bernard sold his first painting there, he said. And Anquetin sold a study. I exchanged paintings with Gauguin, so we all got something. Van Gogh drew 4 known sketches on the back of the Du Chalet's menu. These include nude woman squatting over a basin. After Van Gogh's first exhibition, his reputation grew steadily among artists, art critics, dealers and collectors. Van Gogh created more than 40 self-portraits between 1885 and 1889. They were usually completed in series, such as those painted in Paris in mid-1887, and continued until shortly before his death. Generally, the portraits were studies, created during periods when he was reluctant to mix with others, or when he lacked models and painted himself. His self-portraits reflect a high degree of self-scrutiny. Often, they were intended to mark important periods in his life. For example, the mid-1887 Paris series were painted at the point where he became aware of Claude Monet, Paul Cézanne and Paul Signac. In self-portrait with grey felt hat, heavy stains of paint spread outwards across the canvas. It is one of his most renowned self-portraits of that period, with its highly organized rhythmic brushstrokes, and the novel halo derived from the neo-impressionist repertoire. Van Gogh himself called it a purposeful canvas. Van Gogh's mental and physical condition is usually apparent in these works. He may appear unkempt, unshaven, or with a neglected beard. He sometimes revealed deeply sunken eyes, a weak jaw, and missing teeth. Some show him with full lips, a long face or prominent skull, or sharpened, alert features. His hair is sometimes depicted in a vibrant reddish hue, and at other times ash-colored. The strong contrast of vivid colors highlight the haggard pallor of his skin. Some depict the artist with a beard, others without. He can be seen with bandages, in portraits executed just after he mutilated his ear. In only a few does he depict himself as a painter. Those painted later in the Saint Remy Asylum show the head from the right, the side opposite his damaged ear, as he painted himself reflected in a mirror. After 2 years, Van Gogh began to tire of the frenetic city life in Paris, having painted more than 200 paintings during his time there. In a letter to Theo in 1888, he said, "It seems to me almost impossible to be able to work in Paris, unless you have a refuge in which to recover and regain your peace of mind and self-composure. Without that, you'd be bound to get utterly numbed." He longed for the peace of the countryside, for sun, and for the light and colors of the landscape, which he hoped to find in the south of France. He left Paris, and after a train journey that lasted a day and a night, he arrived in Arles, a small town on the river Rhône in Provence in February 1888. At first, Arles appeared exotic to him, and he was delighted with the bright light and colors. The arrival of spring found Van Gogh in a fury of work. As he wrote to his brother Theo, "The trees are in blossom, and I would like to do an orchard of tremendous gaiety." Between March and April, the artist dedicated 14 canvases to the subject, working in a range of sizes, formats, and styles. This composition, dominated by the angular elongated branches of the budding trees, attests to Van Gogh's admiration for Japanese prints. He painted swiftly, and although he brought to this series a version of Impressionism, a strong sense of personal style began to emerge during this period. The transience of the blossoming trees, and the passing of the season, seemed to align with his sense of impermanence and belief in a new beginning in Arles. In June he made trips to the coast, where he painted the fishing boats on the beach. In these works, he strove to respect the external visual aspect of a figure or landscape, but found himself unable to suppress his own feelings about the subject. This found expression in emphatic contours and heightened effects of color. Once hesitant to move away from the traditional techniques of painting, Van Gogh now gave free rein to his individuality and began squeezing his tubes of oil paint directly onto the canvas. His style was spontaneous and instinctive. He worked with great speed and intensity, determined to capture an effect or a mood while it possessed him. His time in Arles was one of Van Gogh's more prolific periods. He completed 200 paintings and more than 100 drawings and watercolors while he was there. Three months after arriving in Arles, Van Gogh moved from the hotel he had been staying in to the Café de la Gare, where he rented a room above the café for 1 franc a night. He became friends with the café's owners, Joseph and Marie Junot, and took all his meals there. Earlier in Paris, Van Gogh had hoped to form a separate impressionist group with other artists whom he believed had similar aims, but this had never eventuated. Now in Arles, he began thinking of founding an artistic retreat and commune. A studio of the South, he called it, where like-minded painters could gather, to create a new and personally expressive art. In May 1888, Van Gogh signed a lease for 4 rooms in what was to become his Yellow House. The rooms cost 15 francs per month, unfurnished. His landlady was Widow Venissac, who also owned several other buildings in the area, including the Café de la Gare. The 2 large rooms on the ground floor were his studio and kitchen, and 2 smaller rooms on the first floor served as bedrooms. Wanting to display his work, and to decorate his gallery, Van Gogh started a series of paintings that eventually included some of his best-known works. One of these was the Night Café, depicting the Café de la Gare, where he would drink in the evenings, often with his friend the postman Joseph Roulin. In this painting he claimed he tried to express the idea that the café is a place where one can ruin oneself, go mad, or commit a crime. "I've tried to express the mood, the terrible human passions, with the red and the green," he said. On his arrival in Arles, Van Gogh had made friends with a neighbor, Joseph Roulin, who worked as a postman in the town. Van Gogh found comfort and companionship with the Roulin family, and Roulin became a loyal and supporting friend to Van Gogh during his stay in Arles. Van Gogh was fascinated by Roulin's face and character, and idealized him as a man of the people. He painted several portraits of him and his family. In each portrait, Roulin wears his dark blue uniform, with the word post clearly legible across his hat. In this portrait, Roulin is depicted in the uniform he always wore proudly, set against an imaginative backdrop of swirling flowers. This series is unique in many ways. Although Van Gogh loved to paint portraits, it was difficult for financial and other reasons for him to find models. So, finding an entire family that agreed to sit for paintings, in fact for several sittings each, was a bonus. In 5 versions of the lullaby, Van Gogh painted Augustine Roulin quietly holding a rope that rocks the unseen cradle of her infant daughter. Van Gogh had planned for it to be the central image of a triptych, flanked by paintings of sunflowers. In a letter to his brother Theo, the artist wrote that, of all genres, the modern portrait excited him the most. I want to paint men and women with that something of the eternal which the halo used to symbolize, and which we try to convey by the actual radiance and vibration of our coloring. Van Gogh worked hard to be a painter of rural life and nature. During his first summer in Arles, he used his new palette to paint landscapes and traditional rural life. His belief that a power existed behind the natural led him to try to capture the essence of nature in his art, sometimes through the use of symbols. His renditions of the Sower, at first copied from Jean-François Millet, reflect his thoughts on the heroism of physical labor, as well as his religious beliefs, showing Christ, sowing life beneath the hot sun. Energized by the local countryside and light, his works from this period are rich in yellow, ultramarine and mauve. They include harvests, wheat fields and general rural landmarks from the area. This includes the old mill, an example of a picturesque structure bordering the wheat fields beyond. This was one of 7 canvases sent to the Pont-Aven Group in October 1888, in an exchange of works with Paul Gauguin, Émile Bernard and Charles Laval. When he visited the nearby seaside town of Saintes-Maries-de-la-Mer in June, he gave lessons to Edzot's second lieutenant, Paul-Eugène Milliet, and painted boats on the sea and the village. During this period, Van Gogh adopted a brighter palette and a bolder attack, particularly in paintings such as his seascape at Saintes Maries. In June 1888, Vincent's brother Theo, who wanted to help Vincent get started on his Studio of the South idea, offered artist Paul Gauguin monthly payments of 150 francs, in exchange for one painting a month, provided he went to live with his brother Vincent in Arles. In response, Gauguin sent Vincent a self-portrait, painting himself as the main character of the Victor Hugo novel, Les Miserables. He described the work as depicting the misunderstood artists of his time, which he believed Van Gogh would identify with. The cheerful floral pattern on the wall was Gauguin's way of testifying to artistic virginity. Van Gogh painted several landscapes with flowers, including roses and sunflowers. There are 2 series of dying sunflowers. The first was painted in Paris in 1887, and shows flowers lying on the ground. The second set was completed a year later in Arles, and shows a bouquet in a vase, positioned in early morning light. In this series, Van Gogh was intending to display his technical skill and working methods to Gauguin, who was about to visit. The 1888 paintings were created during a rare period of optimism for the artist. Gauguin arrived in Arles in late October 1888, but only after considerable coaxing. Theo had to pay for his travel expenses, but he was glad to do so for his brother's sake. Van Gogh and Gauguin worked together for 2 months, and influenced each other's style to some extent. However, their opposing ideas and temperamentally incompatible characters caused their relationship to rapidly deteriorate over the time Gauguin stayed there. They began by setting up an ambitious painting schedule, despite it being the wettest weather on record. When it rained, the two painted inside a café, the scene for Gauguin's painting, Café at Arles. Painting together, they turned out an impressive number of canvases, often of the same scenes. On more than one occasion, they set up their easels side by side to paint portraits, for example, this painting, Augustine Roulin, the postman's wife. While Van Gogh rapidly completed his painting with large brushstrokes, Gauguin took his time using washes of flat bold colors that almost resembled Japanese woodblock prints. Gauguin worked mainly from memory in his imagination, while Van Gogh preferred to paint what he could see in front of him. Gauguin experimented with Van Gogh's technique of completing a painting in one sitting. This was very different from his usual approach, which involved working over many sessions. However, he thought the result was a pleasing, more energetic portrait. Working alongside Gauguin, Van Gogh was similarly influenced by his friend's style. In this painting of the garden of his parents' home at Eton, created at the time, he uses flattened space and broad areas of color typical of Gauguin. He then overlaid it with the intense colors and rough surface textures he felt it needed to express his own impressions of the bright sun and resonant colors of the South. As time passed, the two volatile artists often engaged in long and sometimes angry conversations about the meaning of art. At the end of 9 weeks, Van Gogh's depressed and occasionally violent emotional episodes led to the breakdown of their artistic partnership. The Dutch painter's mental health was rapidly deteriorating, and Gauguin decided he ought to leave. When Van Gogh heard this, he became so distraught that he threatened Gauguin with a razor. Later that evening, he sliced off his own ear, wrapped it in newspaper and presented it to a prostitute in a nearby brothel. Van Gogh was hospitalized the following day, and Gauguin left Arles and never saw Van Gogh again. Van Gogh's brother Theo rushed down by train as soon as he heard the news, and found Vincent in the hospital in Arles. The hospital staff realized from his agitation that Van Gogh was showing symptoms of mental illness, and were uncertain if he would recover his sanity. Later, Van Gogh remembered little about the ear incident, and he returned home after a fortnight and resumed painting, producing this mirror image self-portrait with bandaged ear and pipe, as well as several other paintings. In the months that followed, Van Gogh's mental health fluctuated sharply. At the end of April 1889, fearful of losing his renewed capacity for work, which he regarded as a guarantee of his sanity, he asked to be temporarily shut up in an asylum at Saint-Rémy-de-Provence in order to be under medical supervision. Van Gogh was admitted as a private patient, paid for by his brother Theo. He immediately began working again. Among his first subjects were the lilac bushes and irises in the hospital garden. Later, he was allowed to work outside the hospital too. He was also given a spare room inside the clinic to use as a studio, where he produced a series of works, including copies of prints after paintings by artists like Rembrandt and Millet. During this period, Van Gogh tried to stay within what he called the guise of reality, and became critical of overly stylized works. He wrote afterwards that the abstraction of his painting, Starry Night, had gone too far, and that reality had receded too far in the background. This painting is now in the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Van Gogh's mental health continued to fluctuate. He feared losing touch with reality, and was confined for long periods to his cell or the asylum garden. During one period of extreme confusion, he ate some of his oil paint, which were taken from him, and he was confined to a small bare locked room, instead of his usual bright bedroom and separate studio on an upper floor. Overall, Van Gogh was exceptionally productive at Saint-Rémy, where he completed around 150 paintings in the space of a year. During the last 6 or 7 months of his stay, he began painting olive trees, a subject which he considered both demanding and compelling. Among these works are olive trees with the Alpilles in the background. In a letter to his brother, Van Gogh wrote, "At last, I have a landscape with olives." Spending time outside the asylum, he continued the theme and painted trees in the olive groves. In these works, natural life is rendered as gnarled and arthritic, as if a personification of the natural world. Van Gogh stayed in the asylum for 12 months, haunted by recurrent attacks, alternating between moods of calm and despair, and working intermittently. He began to abandon the vivid sun-drenched colors of the previous summer, making his painting calmer. As he repressed his excitement, however, he involved himself more imaginatively in the drama of the elements, developing a style based on dynamic forms, and a vigorous use of line. The best of his Saint-Rémy pictures are bolder and more visionary than those he produced in Arles. Van Gogh's brother Theo was kept informed by the stream of illustrated letters from his brother, but also news from the asylum director of Van Gogh's 3 serious collapses over the year. His brother, recently married and expecting his first child in Paris, stayed away. After the birth, Van Gogh received an announcement in the mail at Saint-Rémy. Theo and his wife Jo had named their son after him. Vincent sent them a painting from the hospital as a gift. 15 of Van Gogh's canvases from Saint-Rémy depict cypresses, a tree he became fascinated with in Arles, where they appeared in the distance, as windbreaks in fields. In Saint-Rémy he began to bring them into the foreground. Vincent wrote to Theo in May 1889, saying, "Cypresses still preoccupy me, I should like to do something with them. They are beautiful in line and proportion. Like an Egyptian obelisk." His cypress pictures are characterized by swirls and densely painted impasto, and include his picture, The Starry Night, in which cypresses dominate the foreground. In January 1890, 6 of Van Gogh's paintings were exhibited at the 7th exhibition of the 20, a group of 20 Belgian painters, designers and sculptors who held exhibitions in Brussels every year. Also displayed were works by Paul Cézanne, Camille Pissarro, Pierre-Auguste Renoir, Paul Signac and Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec. Van Gogh's painting The Red Vineyard was sold at the exhibition to artist Anna Bach for 400 francs. It was to be the only sale of Van Gogh's paintings made during his lifetime. In a letter to Theo at the time he commented on his lack of success, "I can do nothing about it if my paintings don't sell," he said. "The day will come though, when people will see that they are worth more than the cost of the paint and the labor that I put into them." 10 of Van Gogh's works were presented at the March 1890 exhibition of the Society of Independent Artists. Paul Gauguin, Claude Monet, and Camille Pissarro were quite impressed with his works. Theo wrote to him at the time, congratulating him on his success. "How pleased I would have been if you'd been there at the Independence exhibition," he said. "Your paintings were well placed, and look very well. Many people came up to me to give you their compliments. Gauguin said that your paintings are the key to the exhibition." During this time, Van Gogh's health ebbed and flowed between periods of attacks, recovery, and resumption of painting. In April 1890, near the end of Van Gogh's stay at St. Paul's Hospital, Theo wrote to his sister and mother, "I am so pleased that Vincent's work is being more appreciated. If he were fit, I believe that there would be nothing for me to desire, but it appears that this is not to be." At his own request, Van Gogh was released from the mental hospital in May 1890, despite evidence of mental collapse following his previous brief breaks from the asylum. He longed to see Theo and the North once more, and yearned for new spring landscapes to paint. He blamed the company of his fellow patients for his previous and longest collapse, and wrote, "The prison was crushing me." The final medical note described Van Gogh as cured. He traveled to Auvers-sur-Oise in northern France to begin again. Arriving in Auvers, he rented a room at an inn and continued to work. He regularly visited Dr. Paul Gachet, who lived there, and was himself an amateur painter and also friends with both Camille Pissarro and Paul Cézanne. Gachet advised Van Gogh that for his health, he should devote himself completely to his art. And Van Gogh did precisely that, painting the gardens and wheat fields around the village at a feverish rate. Auvers offered Van Gogh the peace and quiet he needed, while being close enough to Paris for him to visit his brother Theo. He threw himself entirely into his painting, and in 3 months, he completed almost 70 works. His health seemed to be improving too. At peace, he worked at first enthusiastically. His choice of subjects such as wheat fields, the river valley, peasants' cottages, the church, and the town hall reflects his spiritual relief. The natural forms in his paintings became less contorted, and in the northern light he adopted cooler, fresh tonalities. His brushwork became broader and more expressive, and his vision of nature more lyrical. His wheat fields at Auvers with White House shows a more subdued palette of yellows and blues, which creates a sense of idyllic harmony. In July 1890, Van Gogh visited Theo and his family in Paris. He learned that his brother was thinking of quitting his job at the art dealers he had managed over many years, and setting up his own business. This represented a substantial financial risk, and Van Gogh returned to Auvers a worried man. On his return to Auvers, Van Gogh wrote to Theo saying, "Now that I am back here, I feel very sad. The storm that threatens you also weighs heavily upon me. What can be done? I usually try to be quite good-humored, but my life too is attacked at the very root. My step is also faltering." Both Theo and his wife wrote to Vincent to reassure him. But financial uncertainty and fear that his nervous attacks might return took a heavy toll on Van Gogh's health. He could not shake off his gloom about the future, and his feelings of guilt at his financial dependence on Theo, and his inability to succeed. His painting, Wheatfield with Crows, shows the artist's state of mind in his final days. Its dark palette and heavy brushstrokes convey a sense of menace. In July 1890, Van Gogh again wrote to Theo, describing his painting. "It shows immense stretches of wheatfields under turbulent skies," he said. "And in it I made a point of trying to express sadness, and extreme loneliness. I believe that this canvas will tell you what I can't say in words." On July 27, Van Gogh, in despair of ever being able to overcome his loneliness or to be cured, went into the fields to paint, as he did every day. This time things ended differently. Van Gogh attempted to kill himself by shooting himself in the chest with a pistol. He managed to return to his hotel that evening, and when found wounded in his bed, a doctor was called. The innkeeper remained with him until his brother arrived from Paris. Van Gogh died 2 days later, at the inn with Theo by his side. Van Gogh's body was set out in the painter's room of the inn, where it was surrounded by the last of his canvases and masses of yellow flowers, including dahlias and sunflowers. His easel, folding stool and brushes stood before the coffin. The cemetery where he was to be buried was on a little hill above fields that were ripe for harvest. Dr. Gachet, trying to suppress his tears, stammered out a few words of praise, expressing his admiration for an honest man, and a great artist who had only two aims: art and humanity. At the time, a French art critic wrote that Van Gogh's suicide was an infinitely sad loss for art. "His death means the extinction of a beautiful flame of genius," he said. "And the artist has gone to his death as obscure and neglected as he lived." The name Vincent van Gogh was virtually unknown when he died. Only one news article about him had appeared during his life. Of the more than 800 oil paintings and 700 drawings that constitute his body of work, he sold only one in his lifetime. 6 weeks after Van Gogh's death, Theo organized a memorial exhibition of his brother's work in his own home. Around 100 paintings hung in various rooms for months, virtually unseen by the general public. Other artists came to see them, however, and fortunately, a number of journalists too. Theo's many exertions and setbacks meant his own health was now steadily deteriorating. Shortly after the exhibition, he resigned from his management position at the art dealers, and promptly suffered a severe nervous breakdown. He was admitted to a clinic in Utrecht, where he died at the end of January 1891, barely 6 months after his brother's death. After Theo's death, Vincent van Gogh's paintings came under the care of his widow, Jo van Gogh-Bonger. She was a Dutch woman in her 20s who had not known either her husband or her brother-in-law for very long. After Theo's death she moved to a small Dutch town, taking Vincent and Theo's art collection with her. She remarried in 1901, and the family moved to Amsterdam 2 years later. From then on, she worked tirelessly to raise public awareness of Vincent van Gogh's paintings in various ways, including arranging exhibition loans of his work to museums all over the world. In 1914, Theo's remains were moved by his widow to his brother's grave site in a little cemetery in Auvers, where today the two brothers lie side by side, with identical tombstones. In the same year, she published the first edition of Vincent's letters to his brother Theo, and to other friends, written between 1872 and 1890. There are more than 600 letters from Vincent to Theo, and around 40 from Theo to Vincent. These documents give such a vivid account of the artist's aims and beliefs, his hopes and disappointments, and his fluctuating physical and mental state, that they form a unique and touching biographical record of Vincent van Gogh's life. Thanks to Jo's efforts, Van Gogh's story began to capture the public's imagination as an emblem of a misunderstood genius. This mythical Van Gogh has become almost inseparable from his art, inspiring artists to dramatize his saga in poems, novels, films, operas, dance ensembles, orchestral compositions, and popular songs. Within the span of a century, Vincent van Gogh has become one of the most recognized painters of all time. There are record-breaking attendance at exhibitions of his works, and commercial items featuring imagery from his body of work continue to be popular. Today, Van Gogh's works are among the world's most expensive paintings. Those sold for over $100 million include Portrait of Dr. Gachet, Portrait of Joseph Roulin, and Irises. His legacy is celebrated by the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam, which opened in 1973, and holds the world's largest collection of his paintings and drawings. The museum regularly receives more than 1.5 million visitors a year. 85% of them are international travelers. Despite his tragic life, Vincent van Gogh left an indelible mark on modern art that continues to resonate today. His bold use of color, emotional intensity, and distinctive brushwork revolutionized artistic expression, and his ability to convey raw emotion through his paintings has inspired other artists to move in similar directions. Van Gogh helped shape the very foundations of modern art, and though commercially unsuccessful during his lifetime, his growing fame after his death reveals how society's values can change. Without Vincent van Gogh, modern art would undoubtedly have looked far different than it does today.